Jamie Ducharme, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. As I was saying, as we were chatting before we got started today, I was so excited to see that your book got optioned to be a new documentary, a new docuseries, because this topic of vaping and the rise and fall of JUUL is something that just professionally for me has been so impactful on the trajectory of my career in terms of helping young people. But I'd like to actually start by just asking you, starting with the basics, what got you interested in the topic of vaping and JUUL in the first place to do the investigative journalistic piece?
Yeah, so I'm a health and science reporter at Time Magazine in my day job. And about, I guess, almost 5 years ago now, or roughly 5 years ago, JUUL was really beginning to take off among teenagers, other vapes too, but JUUL in particular. And we were getting a lot of interest from parents, a lot of questions from parents, just basically wanting to know what this thing was, why their kids were suddenly using it, because for many teenagers, they'd never smoked. You know, their parents were not even worried about smoking. It wasn't on their radar. And then all of a sudden, you know, they were finding JUUL pods in their kids' bedrooms or whatever it was. So I started looking into it largely from that angle, kind of just describing what the problem was, what the device was, what the health effects were, you know, based on the research that we had at that time. And then as I kept covering it, like new angles kept kind of making themselves known to me. I thought the path of the company was really interesting. The founders who created it were interesting characters to me. You know, there's a political angle, there's like an advocacy angle. So at that point, it all, you know, to explore all of that fully, that's when it became the book, which has now become the Netflix series as well.
Yeah. Well, so there's so many different themes, and I'm sure we're going to poke around in a lot of them today. But I'm wondering, from the perspective of the author, what are you hoping that we take away from this, aside from the fact that it's just a very enthralling, true story of something that just recently happened and is still affecting the world? What difference are you hoping to make?
Well, I get asked this question a lot, and it's an interesting one for me because as a journalist, I don't often go into a story kind of from an advocacy angle. I aim to present the facts as best I can and the different perspectives, and then let people, you know, draw the conclusions that they want to from that. And to be honest, that's what I tried to do in my book as well. I guess if I hope anything, or if I want people to take away anything, it's just that this story is complex and nuanced and layered, because I think there is a ton of polarization when it comes to vaping. Some people think it is potentially life-saving and a really good innovation. Others think it's kind of evil or just bad, straight up bad. And I tend to think the truth is more complex than that and somewhere closer to the middle. So I guess that's what I hope people take from both the book and the series.
Yeah, there were a lot of themes of this question of, like, is the tech mentality essentially destructive when you put it in the hands of, or in the arena of public health, or is technology, like this double-edged sword? I think, it struck me about vaping, and I say this as someone who is a psychologist, who sees the science side. I'm very involved in both prevention and harm reduction worlds, that sometimes it's not as much about the tool itself, but how the tool is used.
Right.
And how it's launched. And I know from that perspective, another theme throughout the book, throughout the documentary, was this question of, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but when did they lose their way? We talk a lot about this original mission of smoking related harm and death and trying to eliminate that. From your perspective, did it ever get fully lost? At a certain point, was it too late?
I think it was too late almost from the beginning. I mean, to your point of the tool itself sometimes mattering less than the way it's used, I think JUUL, the product, could have been effective, could have been successful. I mean, I've talked to many smokers who said this worked for me in a way that nothing else had. And I think that matters. That's a powerful statement. However, JUUL, the company, made mistakes from the first day, really. I mean, their very first launch campaign, which has been written about and publicized quite a bit, including in this project, was a lifestyle marketing campaign. It was young people dancing around holding JUULs, like making it look like this fun, cool thing that you'd want to use at a party. And I think if your goal is truly to sell this to adults who are already smoking, that's not going to be, effective, especially in the demographics that we know are most likely to smoke cigarettes at the time when they launched, which was it was 2015, so not all that long ago. So I always say that JUUL, the company, kind of put a target on its back right from the very beginning, because no matter what they did after that point, people would turn back to the first launch campaign and say, it looks an awful lot like you were targeting teenagers, whether or not they meant to. That is the reputation that they had moving forward, and I think they still have today.
Yeah, it doesn't pass the sniff test, right? You just look at it and you're like, this is not a 55-year-old chain smoker.
Right.
Like that's if that's who you're targeting, that's not what we're seeing in these ads.
Right. And I spoke to some people who worked at the company at the time that campaign came out, including in marketing, but at lower level positions where they were not actually making the campaign. And they thought the same thing. They were confused. I remember one person told me, we thought it looked like a Gap ad. Like, because Gap at that time had a lot of wholesome families dancing around in jeans and sweaters type ads. And that's what it reminded them of. Like, there was nothing in there that would make you think this is a nicotine delivery device. It just looked like a lifestyle marketing campaign.
Right. Well, and there were a few quotes around that issue that really stood out to me from your research and from the series. The question of, I think one was you can't have public health, something along the lines of, you can't have public health if nobody buys it. And then there was another one about the question of, you've got these ideas, right? You've got theories, you've got schematics, but then there's this question of, well, then how do you sell it? Right. There's a business. And I guess what I'm wondering is, from your perspective, having done all of this research, does it seem like there is a path forward for a product without having to cater to those sorts of needs or values or demographics? Like, did this have to happen?
It's such a good question. And I struggle with this because I can see how it would be hard to explain in a short period of time, succinctly, basically, like what the product is, how it works, who it's for, how it should be used in a way that makes people, the right people, even adult smokers, want to use it. Like, marketing kind of to work has to be a little flashy. I shouldn't say has to be, but often is a little flashy and fun and eye-catching, and that's what sells. So I understand the difficulty. But I think you have to, if you're selling a product that you inhale into your lungs and that is highly addictive, it's probably better to play it safe and produce a campaign that maybe is a little less sexy, but more responsible. And that's clearly not the path that JUUL took. And if they could have been successful in another avenue, I don't know. It's an alternate version of reality that doesn't exist. So it's hard to talk about, but yeah, it's a really interesting and tough question, I think.
Yeah. I think I agree with your assessment that this might have been doomed, at the very least, from that moment forward. I know when I look, and I read some of the various attorney generals who filed complaints and actually looked at some of and was just absolutely flabbergasted by some of what was in there. Like, when you look at it and you look at the pictures and the early design, and some of the decisions made around, should there be like nicotine kill switches and then no, or all of these different aspects, be almost akin to what we saw with Purdue Pharma and OxyContin, where it's like, when if you throw gasoline all over a house and then toss in a match, it's very difficult to try to say, well, oh, one, I didn't mean to do it, but then also, like, to take it back, like the house is on fire.
Right.
At that point.
Right. And I think JUUL tried to take it back. The way they operate now, I always say, is closer to what they should have been doing in the very beginning. Like, JUUL really doesn't advertise much at all, if at all, now. But to the extent that they did a few years ago, the campaigns were like, people in their 50s talking about how they used to smoke a pack a day and now they're using JUUL. And I think if they had come out with something like that in the beginning, the story might have been different. I always say that.
Yeah, well, and I think you're right. I remember when they first did the pivot, because we lived through this, and particularly if you are in the realm of addiction and teen health, you saw this mortified in real time. I remember when they first made that pivot, and they had these folks who were actually like the right age talking about
Right.
quitting smoking, and it was like, oh man, like on the one hand, good for you. On the other hand, like look at what you already did. Like I don't even know if I can believe you anymore,
Right.
because at that point we were hearing about, and this was in the book and the series as well. They were going into like kids' classrooms. They were, and the flavors. Let's
Mhm.
pivot there for a second.
Mm, sure.
From your perspective, knowing what we know about flavoring and nicotine, flavoring and tobacco, what we've seen, whether or not we're talking about menthol, mint, fruity flavors, the fact that we banned them in cigarettes in 2009 because they appeal to children. Do you, again, having spoken to a lot of people around, orbiting around this, were they just completely ignorant or naive to this? Was this just somehow not learning from the past to a tragic degree, or what's your take on this?
I think the flavor issue is really tough because, yes, I mean, survey data clearly shows that flavors appeal to teenagers, and that's a problem. But if in the series, I think in the very first episode, a woman who worked at JUUL before it was even JUUL, when it was called Plume, like when the company very first launched, talked about how they would go out to various venues and like sample the product. And people who smoked would say to them, we want more flavors, because if you're trying to quit smoking and something tastes like tobacco, it's in some ways beneficial to have something that's completely different than a cigarette. Like smokers found that helpful when they were trying to stop using cigarettes. So I do see it from both sides, and I don't think using flavors is an entirely malicious choice. But I do think, to your point about them having been banned in cigarettes already, like there was history that probably could and should have been learned from more than it was. Not just with flavors, really,
Hmm.
but with in many ways that the tobacco industry went wrong. I think JUUL should have paid closer attention to that and didn't. But the flavors one is sticky because there are smokers that I've interviewed who say, like, if JUUL had only come in tobacco, I wouldn't have used it. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, I guess I'm interested in your take on that as somebody who works with people who are trying to stop being addicted to things.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And I think, I mean, and there was, in thinking about the series as well, there was a former smoker who was talking about how he was able to make this transition using vapes. And I think, so from a clinical perspective, I know one of the aspects that has gotten, if we leave the business side for a second, one of the parts to me that has always been, I guess to be honest, like got ground my gears about this whole phenomenon, is that we have FDA approved methods for smoking cessation as well as therapies. And the most recent data we have shows that only about a third of people, smokers, use the medications during their quit attempts, and only about 6% of people try therapy.
Hmm.
And so when we think then about, and this was a point also that was made early on in the series, this question of children being collateral damage, something that unfortunately in the world today we're talking about a lot,
Hmm.
right now with what's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Like how much of that is acceptable? And it's not to say necessarily that there isn't some health benefit. I mean, sure, there's no tar, or I shouldn't say health benefit. I should say reduction in health risk
Hmm.
from switching entirely from smoking to vaping. And how do we balance of like, do you need a blueberry vape to help someone either quit smoking or reduce the harms of smoking?
Hmm.
I don't know. I guess to me, I'd say no. I think I'd also say that when I look at how many kids have gotten onto nicotine and what we're learning about vaping over time, there was just a study published, I think, 2 weeks ago that was looking at how literally on the cellular level, when you expose, and this wasn't even with nicotine, this was just with vegetable glycerin, PGVG, and a flavor of some sort. Those are the liquid bases for listeners who aren't familiar of vape juice. That alone changes the way that the immune, that basically factors of cells react and depresses your immune system.
Right.
So I mean, for me, and I know I might be biased. I feel like kids come first.
Yeah,
I don't know how you feel about it, but
I think that's a completely fair stance. And yes, of course, I want to go on record saying, yes, we need to protect kids and make sure that they are not using nicotine or any addictive substance. But I think what struck me when I was reporting the book is the extent to which smokers felt like they had been completely forgotten about, because so much of the media coverage and scrutiny on JUUL was related to kids, rightfully. I'm not saying that wasn't a rightful focus. But all of these adult smokers who I talked to said, like, nowhere in these stories was it mentioned that not everyone who JUULed was a kid, that some people actually were adult smokers using the product. And so I guess hearing that perspective did change my thinking a little bit, and made the story feel a little bit more complex to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what I wish we knew, and I know we probably never will, is whether or not these were discussions that were even being had. Like, do you have a feel for that? Like, was this ever something that came up and said, like, hey, we know that flavors have been used with nicotine to ensnare kids in the past. We see how this works, but we don't think it'll be an issue this time?
I guess I can't directly answer that question. I can't speak to that element of it. What I do know in talking to people who worked at JUUL was that there was this sense, in part because the two founders were smokers, there was this sense that they felt they needed to offer flavors because smokers wanted it. And you made the point that you don't think a blueberry vape is necessary, and I think that's a valid argument. Honestly don't know where I fall on that question, but I think that's, from what I've been told, that is the angle that they came from.
Yeah. Well, and hindsight is always 2020. I know for me, I think the value of, or one piece of the value of your work is that we all now can hopefully be more aware of the questions that perhaps should have been asked in these boardrooms and in these meetings, and should have been made explicit and spoken about, because this idea of history repeating itself. There was a quote by a mother of a son who was vaping that stuck out to me too. It hadn't really occurred to me about the responsibility of companies to fix the problems that they might cause, right? I think she called it an exquisite prison, is how she called JUUL, where, like, you've designed a nicotine hit that's smoother, that tastes better, that's stronger. You've created this, but then, so, like, what happens when people move from one jail cell to another?
Yeah, this is something that I do think is highly problematic. I've spoken to a lot of people who say, I am more addicted to JUUL than I ever was to cigarettes, which I guess is something that's a little difficult to quantify, but just based on the amount that they use it, like waking up and immediately hitting a JUUL right before they go to sleep, using it all day long. I hear that all the time. And I absolutely think JUUL should have done more research and had a better plan for how to wean people off of JUUL, because I think, there's a ton of questions still about the health effects of vaping, but I think most, if not all, experts would agree that as little time that you're using it, it's better to use it for less time than more time. So if people are just becoming even more addicted to a new nicotine product and potentially using it for the rest of their life, that's a problem. And I think that is something that JUUL and other e-cigarette makers, to be fair, have not fully grappled with as much as they should.
Yeah. Well, and looking at, there was a study that came out, I want to say about a month ago now, that was looking at the trajectory of vape devices generally over time. And that over the last 5 years, and I might get these numbers slightly wrong, but they're going to be close. Potency in e-cigs has, on average, based on what's sold, increased by 30%. Capacity has increased by, I think it was 5 times. And prices have gone down by 70%. And so when we talk then about, and this was mentioned in the book and series as well, that, like, you can, one of these pods, a JUUL pod or a disposable vape these days, are more popular with kids because of regulatory changes around JUUL and flavors. There, you can hold so much, and you don't have to stop.
Right. This was something that I found really interesting when I was reporting my book. I spoke to the chemist who helped develop what became JUUL pods. And her concern, and I think other people in the company shared this at the time, was that there is no off switch, really. Like, when you're smoking a cigarette, the cigarette burns out and you have to sort of make a conscious choice of if you're going to pick up another. A JUUL pod, like, it's 200 puffs. You could just sit there all day pulling on this thing,
Yeah.
consuming a massive amount of nicotine and almost not even realize it, because it's so easy to use. There's not even an on-off switch. All you have to do is inhale. And I found it very interesting to hear that even the chemists who helped develop it had that concern.
Right. Well, and from an addiction psychology standpoint, and where quitting comes from as well, or just habits even in general, habits that have very low friction coefficients tend to stick and are very hard to quit, right? That idea of you don't even have to turn it on. You literally just put it in, or you don't have to go outside because this isn't going to stain your walls and your clothing and everything else. Getting back to the flavors for a second, what's interesting about quitting smoking is that one of the primary factors that you can use to encourage people to quit, actually, there's a very successful, relatively speaking, but a very successful smoking cessation technique based around mindfulness, where part of what you do is you really focus on the flavor of tobacco and smoking, because it does taste awful. Virtually everyone will say it tastes awful.
Yeah.
So almost paradoxically, when you flavor something to be like a fruit or mint, even menthol, we're seeing now menthol cigarettes getting banned, you're taking away that aversive stimulus. You're taking away one of the primary drivers change to quit.
It's interesting. So when I said before that people get more addicted to JUUL, and then I doubled back because I didn't know if that was accurate. Do you think that's an accurate statement?
Oh, so I have not, I don't have data on that. Being a psychologist, I don't like to go too far with my conclusions beyond what I've actually read. I would say anecdotally, though, that there have been plenty of people who have said, they've even said, like, I would never pick up a vape because I know I would just completely descend down into nicotine and would probably never come up because it tastes good, because I could take it to bed with me, and it truly is, in some ways, when you hear this, it's heartbreaking. There was the basement flooded in my house about 6 months ago, and so we had a remediation crew here, and actually the foreman of the crew was talking to me when he found out what I did for a living about how his wife has this problem, and she goes to bed with her vape, she wakes up with her vape, she can't put it down, she becomes very angry even when he expresses concern about it. And if you're worried about secondhand smoke with children or any of those other concerns, you don't have that the same way with vapes.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard a lot of stories like that as well. And even people who I know personally, I've kind of seen struggle with it. So it's interesting. I mean, I hope it's something that companies are thinking about, how to help people quit vapes eventually.
Well, so in here, drilling down back and getting back more to the policy corporate side of this. So one of the concerns that I have, just generally speaking, when we think about addiction and the United States, is that we oftentimes, so I should back up and start by saying addiction is an industry. It is the only behavioral health problem that people literally try to sell to you. No one is out there selling depression or trauma. I mean, I guess, some haunted houses are selling like fear or whatnot, or some movies. But no one is selling diseases actively, like that. No one is selling these problems except for addiction. And the problem is that for all of these industries, if the most successful form of their business is, if your business is addiction, your ultimate goal, your fiduciary responsibility, perhaps as a board, is to addict as many people as possible. And I know for me, one of the tragic ironies of the story that you present is JUUL literally became the cancer they were trying to eradicate. Like literally, they literally sold out to big tech, or not to big tech, just to big tobacco. Like not just metaphorically, literally. And they engaged in so many similar tactics. One of the more powerful visuals I felt from the series was where you juxtaposed the old tobacco ads and marketing with what JUUL was doing. Or when you talk about how they literally went into schools with these education campaigns. I mean, you could read all of this in the Master Settlement Agreement. I guess from your perspective, having really rooted around in this story, how should we conceptualize this? Can an addiction industry, nicotine or otherwise, actually solve a public health problem, Or are the goals of those two issues, public health versus addictive substances, just so divergent that's not the solution?
That's such a good question. I need to think about that for a second. Um,
Yeah.
I do think that there is a place for harm reduction, certainly as a strategy. I think I would feel differently, I guess, if things like nicotine gum and nicotine patches worked better for people. And I know they work for some people and that there's strong evidence to back them, but I've talked to enough people for whom they didn't work and then felt as though their choice was either muscle through quitting cold turkey, which often does not work, as you know, or keep smoking. That I do feel that there is and was room for something in between those two poles, something that's not quitting cold turkey or continuing to smoke. And I think JUUL's story clearly demonstrates that innovation is dangerous if not handled properly, and that it can very easily go wrong. But I don't know. I think JUUL's story is a cautionary tale, but I don't know that it definitively proves that it can't work, if that makes sense. I think there's a lot of room in which, if different decisions were made, perhaps the story would have turned out differently. So I guess I often draw a distinction, I should say, between the company and the product. And I guess here I'll draw it between the idea and the approach. And I think very clearly the approach didn't work. I think there's still room to debate if the idea could have worked.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, and please feel free to correct me on this if you feel differently. I think for me, the confounding factor, the complicating factor is always money. You know, like I imagine, not to say that we can say trust government with anything, but imagine for a second if, say, like like the CDC or the FDA, purely approaching this from a public health standpoint, was saying, how do we create a harm reduction tool that gets people off of smoking, where we're not looking to turn any sort of profit? Our metrics for success are purely reducing harms of smoking, getting people onto a different nicotine delivery system. I don't know. I think that has a chance of ending differently.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do think very clearly in JUUL's story, there are a number of points at which the financial interests of the company and its investors and its board won out over public health. And I do think if you're a public health agency that is not seeking to profit off of a technology, you're in a better position to at least do the right thing. But kind of going back to our previous conversation about, like, can you both have a successful marketing campaign and do it responsibly? I think we've seen it with even things like the COVID vaccine rollout. Like, it's difficult for a government agency to reach certain segments of the population. And so I think it's an interesting question of, like, could they get, even if they had a great product, we're not profiting from it, we're doing everything right, could they get it out at scale? And I don't know the answer, but I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, well, and I think, and this is always the difficulty, right? Like I was just throwing some statistics at you before about how few smokers use even the tools we have available, particularly the behavioral ones. And again, I know I'm biased being a psychologist, but like 1 in 20 people uses something that could potentially, research shows helps them reach their goals. But who's not out there marketing in, sexy, flashy ways or not? Therapists. We're
Right.
that would be very strange. But as a result, like, there we are. We have like 4% market penetration, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
That's not getting the job done. I think, here's another question, just theoretical, about all of this. Going back to that point about it being an exquisite prison, when I think about harm reduction and some of the debates that are going on around it right now, I think for me, the biggest question is it a means to an end, or is it an end in itself? And I think that question looks very different depending on if we're talking about alcohol or opioids or, nicotine or anything else. But I know what rubs me wrong about vaping, particularly as what we've seen over time, is it seemed like JUUL and perhaps other companies as well were viewing it as an end in itself. There was no exit strategy. There was no off ramp for JUUL. It was perhaps like I hesitate to use the word, but almost like an arrogant virtue of being like, well, once they're here, they're safe. Or our goal isn't actually to get people off of nicotine or, inhaling only air into their lungs. Our goal is just to switch them from that vice to this one, which is poisoning them less, but as we've come to learn, is absolutely still poisoning them.
Right. I agree. I think that's a huge problem. I believe it's actually the same parent who said the beautiful, exquisite prison quote, who reached out to JUUL with exactly this question because her son was massively addicted. I think using multiple pods a day, which is a shocking amount of nicotine to use every day.
Yeah.
Reached out to JUUL for help, saying, surely you've done research on how to help him quit. And received back a form letter from a lawyer saying, ask your doctor, we don't know, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist. And that's a huge problem. Like, I don't think, let me back up for a second. Something that I always bring up in conversations like this is that JUUL was founded by two product designers. They were not researchers. They were not doctors. They were not public health experts. And I think you can clearly see that in the genesis of the company because they were not doing extensive research for years. I mean, now they have a much larger staff and they do have researchers who carry out some in-house studies. But for many years, that was not the case. And I think this issue is one really clear example of that, where, yeah, you can argue that the product is better than cigarettes, but also probably people should not be using it for the rest of their lives in an ideal world. And how do you get them off? And I don't think even JUUL has that answer, which is a problem.
Yeah, well, and I guess my add-on to that would be, and it's not in their business interest to have the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
To that question. I mean, and I think, although to be fair to them, and to think about, comparing, I think that if you wrote a similar question to, like Sky Vodka, you get the same answer. I think that if you wrote, a similar email to a casino, you might get like a ChatGPT type response of like, here's where you go, and here's some resources online, and good luck to you, and talk to your doctor about it. But they're not there to help you get better. They're trying to deliver an experience to you.
Right. Yeah, no, addiction is an incredibly profitable business model. You are literally creating customers for life. So of course, JUUL doesn't have a business interest in helping people stop juuling. But then I think if the founders and not just the founders, but people at the company are going to talk this big game about being in it for public health, at a certain point, you have to choose. Are you pursuing profits at all costs, or are you actually in this to do what is best for people's health?
Right. Yeah. And then where's the accountability?
Mm-hmm.
But also looking to the future then, and learning from the past, one of those elements that perhaps was not going on in the founding, in the early days of JUUL. From your perspective, what does the balance look like? When we look at the kids, I think the current number from the CDC is 2.5 million kids right now are vaping. It's still something where it's the topic that I am, I'm a professional speaker, and it's what I speak about most across the country is vaping, nicotine, also THC to a certain extent, but teens who are falling into this, it's very much on parents' minds. Yeah. They're incredibly concerned about it. And at the same time, we still are losing 480,000 people to smoking in our country every year. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I know you probably thought about this more than just about anybody else over the past few years with the work that you've done on this project. What's your take? Where do we go?
I think we are moving in the right direction now that the FDA is actually assessing each product and its health effects and the effect it is likely to have on public health. The FDA's authorization process is one that I find interesting for e-cigarettes because they are not just looking at the target demographic, which is adult smokers. They are looking at the likely effect on the entire nation's public health. So how many kids are likely to start using this? How many adults who didn't previously smoke are likely to start using this? What is it likely to do for adults who did smoke and begin vaping? And I think that is the right way to look at the problem. Excuse me. Because it's not enough to just think about adult smokers, because very clearly those are not the only people who are vaping. So the fact that we are now at a place where the FDA is making those decisions, and the products that they've authorized are kind of the quote unquote boring ones that are like tobacco flavored and not the flashy ones that tend to be very popular among kids, that's positive. I think it should have happened about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, but at least it's happening now. And hopefully we'll continue to move forward, and hopefully the FDA will crack down a bit on vapes that are sold without authorization, which is, a huge chunk of the market at this point. So yeah, I mean, I guess to the extent that we've come up with a solution, that is it. Actually looking at the full picture of how each e-cigarette is likely to impact public health. And I think it's on the FDA to make sure that their decisions are science-based and research-based and enforced. I think that, that's the second part of it.
Yeah. Well, and a quick note on that. So I know for me, one of the biggest, pain points for me is like, well, what can we do as average citizens, perhaps, or of, concerned parents to really get after this at the systems level? Because that enforcement element has been one of the most infuriating parts, when it's like you could see this train wreck happening in real time. Like all you had to do in the early days of JUUL, and even now to some extent, is just like go to a high school, ask the kids what's happening.
Yeah.
Go into, I mean, you should have heard from some of these kids. Some actually who weren't vaping were infuriated that they couldn't have clean air in a bathroom anymore. Like they would walk in there, be all huddled around, everybody's vaping. Everyone knew what was going on. Yet here we are, and it took so long to see any sort of meaningful action to try to curb that. And then, of course, even then, they exempted disposables, and there's still like this game of whack-a-mole, if you will, I feel like, between the FDA, the DEA, and trying to actually clamp down on this. What are we supposed to do? Is there any recourse here, or is this more just about trying to educate our youth to make thoughtful decisions about substance use with eyes open, rather than be manipulated by marketing or trends or fads?
Yeah, this is a tough one. So one piece of research that I find really interesting, and that I cite often when I am asked by parents or, teachers or whoever, of like how to get kids to stop vaping, is that it can be really effective to educate young people about ways in which they are being taken advantage of by companies. It's a natural human response. If you feel like you're being used as a pawn, basically, in a game, and in this case, in a business plan, a business strategy, you feel upset about that. And I think when teenagers learn like the long history of tobacco targeting teens to create customers for life, and see some of the ways in which similar tactics, or at least similar effects, have happened in the vaping industry, there is kind of this indignation and like, I don't want to be part of this. I don't want this. I don't want to help these companies. So I find that, I guess that's why I like to do what I do, because telling this story with all of its warts and all of its complexities kind of helps both parents and kids understand, like, this is our role in this scenario. And I think sometimes that can be enough to fight back.
Yeah. Well, I think awareness is everything. And honestly, when I speak to students, that is always my core message. I'm not here to tell you to vape or not. I'm here to tell you, like, here's what nicotine does to the developing brain. Here's the history of this industry. Why do you think this is cool? Like, let's talk about marketing and how marketing works. Because that sometimes can be enlightening in and of itself.
Yeah.
But I guess as we're getting towards the end of our time here, again, thinking more future oriented, I will say I'm really congratulations. The documentary right now is #1 on Netflix, which is so cool to see.
So crazy.
I know I'm so glad that people are watching it, because I think the story is one that needs to be heard and seen, because I see us, even like right now, repeating these problems again. Let me give you a few examples. I open my phone and I look at my, once Twitter, now X feed, and I see ads for sports betting companies, telling you that your first $1,500 will be given back to you as new bets, which basically means you can already get in the cycle of saying, oh, I'll just win it back again.
Yep.
But of course you won't, right? Because they're not really giving you money. I look out my window. I'm located in Chicago. There's a billboard right by O'Hare Airport that says, drink cannabis. It's better than sex. On a billboard, truly, I'm not making this up, on the side of the road. We see Mountain Dew co-opting their brands now, not with the caffeine, of course, because, we all remember Four Loko, but using the Mountain Dew brand and then putting alcohol into it, which is, of course, so popular with college students. And even if we look at psychedelic medicine right now, the FDA just 3 days ago issued a warning. I mean, there's a lot we could talk about this area, but issued a warning about mail order ketamine, basically compounded ketamine clinics, saying, hey, by the way, none of this is regulated, and there's actually very little evidence to support it. That's popping up because there's an industry jumping the gun and undercutting really promising research in psychedelic medicine that is going through the FDA process. That will I would be very surprised if we don't see psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD within the next 2 years, but done in a medically sound, verified way.
Right.
And we're seeing that in all of these different areas. We're seeing what looks to me like history repeating itself. And so I think this message is so, I think your message is so necessary. I hope people watch it, but I know, again, from my perspective, and part of why I'm so glad to talk to you today and to be able to put this conversation out there, why your documentary is getting the viewership that it is, and your book is hopefully getting the sales that it deserves, is that we need to learn. At some point, we have to look at this and say, maybe this isn't what we should just allow to happen and run roughshod through society.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. And thank you for the kind words about the series in the book. But I think the psychedelic medicine example is such a good one. And that's another area that I've been focusing on more in recent years, because the sheer number of companies that I get emailing me every day about various psychedelics or psychedelic adjacent products that they are peddling without, I would say, the research to do so is shocking. And yeah, I think it's absolutely headed down a similar road as e-cigarettes, where the product itself, could be beneficial, but the companies are sort of tarnishing that and taking it to a place where some of that impact might be degraded by business interest. I hope it plays out differently, because I think some of the research on psychedelics for mental health is incredibly encouraging and strong. So yeah, I just hope that we have a story with a different ending this time.
Yeah, it's like it's the same story, right? Like, here's a tool that could actually do so much good, but then we're starting already to see this fragmentation with mail order ketamine. I mean, I actually did a podcast on this with someone in psychedelic science a few months back, talking again about the fragmentation and this divergence from this really great research being done at Johns Hopkins and others, and then what's happening when industry gets its hands on it and says, well, we need to patent this. We need to push it. There's so much demand. There's so much pain and suffering that we can solve when, like, say, a MDMA protocol for PTSD is like 12 to 16 weeks long and involves 2 trained therapists. And a research protocol, it's very different than what we're seeing really like pushed out the door right now, circumventing the FDA.
Right.
So yeah, that phrase, circumventing the FDA, I don't know. I mean, some people would say, like, you get stuck in bureaucracy. I'd like to say, like, it's there for a reason. Yeah. I'm still a believer in the institution.
I am too. And I think the FDA is not perfect. There's, it moves too slowly. We've seen that very clearly in the whole JUUL saga. But, you need procedures. You need someone guiding the way that, to the extent that we feel business and public health should be mixed, you need somebody who's at least making sure that process happens as responsibly as it can. And I think in the system that we have, that is the FDA. And I think we need to lean on them a little bit more.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with today? A parting thought?
No, this has been such a great conversation. You've asked me some really great questions that I'm going to continue thinking about after we hang up. So no, I'm just so happy to have joined you, and thank you for your interest.
Oh, well, my pleasure. And thanks again, Jamie. And everyone, go watch Big Vape. Go, go buy the book. It's, like all times you have adaptations from books, there's so many more layers of detail and complexity that you can read about in the book if this is a story you care about and you'd like all the nuance. So absolutely worth it. And thanks again so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.